Making a video, DraftScience and such. Yeah. I'm busy lately, unfortunately, but not too many comments, so I'm not really behind. But I really don't like not making a video for a couple of days. Seems so unusual. Yeah. So anyway, not too many comments, so we'll do some of that, and then maybe a Piro video or something to provoke some sort of conversation. And, I mean, clearly that's the objective here, is to try to argue these points. And I'm clearly attempting to convince you to be reasonable and recognize that the evidence for what most of conventional physics believes is really thin evidence. It's a story that's barely glued together. I mean, it just isn't quite right. And anybody mechanical kind of knows that, right? You're fitting pieces together and you're gluing them together, and you kind of know, well, it looks right, but it just doesn't, the angle isn't right, something's not quite right, and you just tell that if I glue these pieces together this way, it might look a little bit like it used to, but it really won't be really secure or right, because it's just not quite right. The surfaces aren't quite meeting. It isn't good enough. And a reasonable person ought to admit that what they've cobbled together isn't good enough. In my opinion, they should be able to say those words without feeling like they've, done something immoral. So it's the truth. It needs to be done better, and it needs to, especially at the foundation, is where it's kind of rotten. These simplistic notions of Heisenberg and Huygens and the whole bent space relativity, all acceleration is the same kind of nonsense. Anyway, so this comment I don't really understand. Kinda see a goat see. I think that's some kind of, that was some sort of website where, you looked up people's anuses or something. I really don't see, the point of it. Just wasting people's time. Alright, pretty good explanations, especially blah blah blah. Who cares? What a loser. Why don't you try to get more viewer without insulting anyone? Because the most view. I mean, why don't you speak English? Oh, you're an anime character, you can't. You get, rather than your junk videos, some sort of laughy face. So Electric Boom does a video claiming that a Professor Lewin is wrong, and clearly knowing that it's going to create controversy and sort of just pretending he didn't know that's what it was going to do. So when he does it, it's not for views or because he thinks he can work it to his advantage or any of that crap. And then when it kind of goes a little bit south on him, that he says, oh, this is creating a little too much heat, he completely pussies out and basically thanks somebody for apologizing by saying, I'm sorry, you're as dumb as a flat earther. So the apology Professor Lewin made was basically saying, I'm sorry, you're as dumb as a flat earther. And Electric Boom said, I win. Yeah. And somebody shouldn't point out how that's really stupid. And because I do that, I've done something wrong. I just point out the duplicity of the critiquer who doesn't have the guts to stand by what he said, which is, you're missing something obvious, and Professor Lewin is clearly missing something obvious, that you can't measure passively the voltage in a system where there's a bunch of EMF flying through the atmosphere hitting your probe wires, that you're not going to get an accurate reading regarding the voltage if there's a bunch of force. Your probes are in the field collecting other forces besides the voltage you're measuring. I mean, it's obviously what's happening. And for Professor Lewin to pretend he can't understand that is hilariously stupid, and somebody should point it out. And again, but somebody with balls should point it out. Somebody who doesn't wimp out and pretend the controversy has been resolved when it hasn't. Professor Lewin isn't changing his rhetoric. An electric boom is clearly implying that he's not changing his, except he's implying that he is, in a sense. He sort of implied that somehow he was wrong without saying, by saying I'm right, but implying he was wrong, which is, again, just such a cop-out, jackass thing to do, and you're going to reward that by trolling me on a subject that's just so clear. You're proud of how Electric Boom handled it? You think he should say thank you for calling me as dumb as a flat earther? I mean, fuck. I mean, this isn't that complicated. You're just such an asshole. Flyora. Strange, but, welcome. I like your attempt. Whatever. It's not just an attempt. I happen to be right, and somebody has to be, and it just happens to be me. Big Think has posted a video a long time ago, so that's sort of a weird sentence. Obviously, they had posted it a long time ago. Yeah, exactly. It's an old video, and it's by pretty much, I think the guy's a string theorist or something. So even though he's talking as if physics needs to straighten up, his version of a straight line is still crooked as hell. So even though I agree that the video is interesting in the sense that he's kind of pointing out that physics needs somebody to fix physics, what he considers a fix, I think, is loop-de-doo. With a mathematician stating that physics needs a revival and that they are wrong and that physics needs a maverick or out-of-here approach. Yeah, you really don't have to be out of anywhere. You just have to be a little bit rational to recognize that they've never proven wave theory. Okay, waves happen in mediums. They've never proven space is a medium. They've never proven photons aren't exactly what they appear to be, which is quanta of energy that moves from point A to point B, and the quanta moves, So I admire your ability to counter-argue the indoctrination. Period. It should be there. Well, again, I'm not really looking for admiration. The point is that I'm making arguments, and people should either be, they should either say, well, I don't see your logic, or they should counter-argue and say how, no, the evidence really is strong, not weak, and that your evidence, my counter-argument for how you really can explain this with physical dynamics. You don't need any extraordinary things. You don't need infinite little wavelets. You don't need complex wave theories, complex interactions even. That the whole thing is basically just momentum being exchanged, and it's usually exchanged 99.99999% of the time, and every real experiment kind of demonstrates this change in momentum. So, okay, whatever. Thank you, mostly. Probably. Partially. So, and that's it. The end of the comments. So, yeah, so maybe we'll just move on and do this wavy thing of Piro's just to mock it as so superficial. It doesn't deal with any of the evidence and doesn't in any way do anything but hype a bunch of hype. Just keep blowing the fake smoke of, oh yeah, we've proven it, we did it, we've demonstrated. No, you haven't done any of this. You haven't done any of it. So it's just all a pile of crap. So in line with his space is a thing video, this is just another bit of hype, propaganda.
Now, having demonstrated that space is a thing.
Right. So, he didn't demonstrate anything. There's no evidence he showed us of the thing, space, doing something. No compilation of the evidence, nothing. Just some sort of word game where he says the space has to create the dimensions that things move in. So somehow, if you have an open field, somehow the cow can't go anywhere if there's no field created by the field gods, because the cow needs to walk on the fields. As if the fundamental elements of the universe are somehow dependent on roads. They're cars and they need a road to drive down. Some sort of BS like that. Hardly a proof, hardly a demonstration of anything. Just bullshit. Just pretend you made a convincing argument with a substantial amount of evidence when you did nothing. You're just the worst of the shyster lawyers who just say, "Look, I'll put up some pretty pictures and you'll believe me because I'll be kind and gentle."
Just like the color red is a thing. Properties are material.
The color red is a thing, so that wasn't even in the conversation, but clearly color is a thing only in the sense that the frequency is a thing. That's it. Now, how we interpret frequency to call something red, that's not a thing. That's not anything real. There's just the frequency, and it's different than this other frequency, and it's different than this other frequency, and our brains can tell the difference. The electrons can tell the difference, and therefore our brains can tell the difference.
Material things as well.
But obviously, a frequency of a photon isn't even comparable to nothing. So I mean, how do you say just like red is a thing? Well, red's made up of a photon at a frequency. There's more than one property it has. What are the properties of space again? Well, that's right. They don't have to have any.
Or only properties by virtue of being things that can be sensed.
So again, I can't sense empty space, in a practical way. And every experiment we do playing with it, they're always kind of deceptive. So the Bill Gates guy has been talking about this same kind of subject of nothing and what it is. And he's brought up, the early days when they first did the, evacuate a cylinder, kind of making the barometer. And then they realized that, this isn't so much about the vacuum created, it's more about the air pressure. And if I put this thing in space, this thing I think that has a vacuum, well, that vacuum isn't going to mean anything in space. And so it's sort of demonstrating that the nothing really is nothing, and it's always something that has to be the real, that's really dictating where something's going to be. It has to do with forces acting on it, not the absence of forces. But you can't stop a force. The fundamental forces can't be well, no, I shouldn't say the fundamental forces. I mean, photons, I would argue, are a force, but they're obviously this more complex force with the electrons, with the frequency. But the elemental forces like magnetism and gravity are pretty hard to make a barrier to.
And measured, right? So, I've obviously demonstrated that.
So, this is what he's being funny. I've obviously demonstrated. No, you've obviously haven't done any of that. Conventional physics hasn't demonstrated anything substantially. They have very weak evidence, very tiny shreds of it seems like, it kind of looks like, it's a little bit like, it's sort of like, but the evidence is terribly incomplete and insufficient. And clearly, if you're honest to the evidence, like with the slit experiments, then you recognize that photons don't behave like waves in the single slit, and they don't behave like waves in the multi-slits. And you're lying to say that it's just like wave phenomenon when it's really not, if you're honest to the evidence. But you people really aren't honest, because you're on a mission to sell your propaganda. You've fallen for a doopy, stupid, wanky theory of unicorn bullshit, and you're trying to seduce everybody else into being just as stupid as you. As if, I don't know why. And again, I really don't know why. I don't know why this mushy wave bullshit means something to you people. It means so much that you will lie about the strength of your evidence. Why are you willing to lie to defend this kind of, to me, really silly notions of stuff swirling and doing all this stuff with no force acting on them? They just somehow know to do this. You know, how do they know how to do that?
Space is a thing. Now, some people could say, hey, there's an apple and a book on a tabletop. The apple brings the three-dimensionality. The book brings three-dimensionality. No, those have to be three-dimensional, just like that.
No, they have to be three-dimensional. So he didn't counter-argue. So somebody argues that, no, the physical material stuff spreads into the 3 dimensions. It moves. It takes up space in those dimensions. It doesn't need the space to provide an opening for it to move into. It moves and claims the space. So there's no need for any mediating capacity to tell me I can go there. The book doesn't need permission from space to go somewhere. How did you argue that? How did you say, no, that's not the truth? That's right. You didn't make any argument.
To have colors from the set of colors. And if they're invisible, or if space had the potential to have infinite amount of dimension.
Well, as I understand, nothing's invisible in any real sense, right? It can only be invisible to our eyes or perception. But clearly there's lots of things we know that are invisible to one instrument, but another instrument can see that just fine. So if it's already something we know exists, visibility is a kind of a silly notion. It's some property that's not necessarily very relevant, whether or not we can see it or not.
That's what someone is saying, basically. It's like, oh, the apple brings the 3 dimensions. Oh, so I could just take this 5-dimensional object and put it on?
So again, how are you going to explain the existence of 5 dimensions? There's absolutely no reason for any rational person to see any room for any 5th dimension. There's no geometry for it in the real universe. We have circles, we have spheres, we have squares, and then we have cubes. We have those things. Those things exist. Now you're making up pretend dimensions that aren't. There's no possible rational way to add them. There is no. They don't exist as anything but something you made up. There's no way to accurately create a 4th or a 5th dimension as a physical dimension. There's no geometry for it. So you're just making it up as if, oh yeah, these are real concepts where I can have a real thing that has a 4th or a 5th dimension. That's all a fantasy. That's like saying it has gremlin dust on it. Or, Sasquatch fur. It's meaningless. Even Sasquatch fur, I shouldn't even say that, because that's a rational extrapolation on some sort of man/animal. Something real. There's no realness to a 4th dimension.
On the table, and there's 5 dimensions there. No, I don't think so. So
I don't think there is any. This isn't a rational comparison, but clearly I could argue, I could take something that's only moving in 2 dimensions, and I could say, well, if it moves in a 3rd dimension, it didn't need somebody else to create the dimension. The dimension was created by its capacity to move. So you could have a car that can only move on the flat Earth, and then you could give the car levitation capacity, and then you can go into the 3rd dimension. But I don't have to create. Space doesn't have to provide the car with the ability. The car has to have the ability. So again, you can demonstrate anything.
You demonstrated that to the point where any reasonable, rational person would agree.
Yeah, well, again, so what is that, comic rhetoric or something? What would compel me? So you're saying I'm irrational if I don't get how profoundly meaningful your non-existent argument was? Your absence of any evidence or reason for me to believe it? There's absolutely no reason to believe that throwing this from one hand to the other requires the atmosphere to participate in any kind of substantial way. This just pushes it out of its way. It doesn't need permission to go from here to here. It doesn't need some space to say it's okay. It's just horse shit. And it's weak. And yet you're too insincere and too dishonest to admit you don't really have an argument. You really can't say it in any kind of rational, reasonable, logical context. This is why you should believe what I believe. Because there is no reasoning to why you believe it. You believe it for some other reason, not because it's reasonable and rational. You believe it because somehow you want it to be true for some dopey reason. And it's likely a religious reason.
I would like to extend my statement to the fact that everything certainly must be wave-like, because
Everything certainly must be. Again, everything I see isn't wave-like at all. I'm not wave-like. This battery's not wave-like. Everything around me is not wave-like. So what are you talking about? Everything must be wave-like. It's complete horse shit. I mean, why are you saying something like that when, like I said, I don't encounter this wave-like crap anywhere until you have a fluid somewhere where you have, pressure that moves through it. And in every one of those cases, none of that pressure moves without losing velocity and intensity. Something that doesn't have anything to do with what force does, because force doesn't lose any intensity or velocity. So there's nothing really comparable. So why would you say something silly like that? Everything's wave-like. I don't see anything that's wave-like, really. And even when there's a wave, it's not really, like I said, it's in a medium. It's not really what people think of as a wave. It's just pressure moving from high pressure to low pressure.
if you have a phenomenon,
and phenomenon meaning what? Just more mushy words. You mean a subnuclear phenomenon, an atomic phenomenon, a molecular phenomenon? What level of the universe is this phenomenon?
let's say you had a phenomenon where there was a two-dimensional representation of it. Hey, it creates circles. And there was a three-dimensional representation of it, which was like, hey, look, all of it together is a sphere.
And again, you could just do this with squares and cubes. So what? Again, why is this some sort of a insightful game to play? 2 dimensions versus 3, flat book versus pop-up book. I mean, what is it that exciting? No, I don't think so.
You would say it was three-dimensional, because the three-dimensional thing, you could take a slice of it and explain the two-dimensional thing. The two-dimensional thing, you can't take a slice of it. There's no part of it that explains.
Sure you can. You take a regular circle and you slice it. You'll get different diameters as you slice it. And the same with the sphere. You slice it, you'll get different diameters. So where's the mystery?
It's a three-dimensional thing. So it's a higher dimensional thing that works. It's like in that old cartoon Flatland. I think it was a book too. But it was this great cartoon. And
again, just more subjective, bullshit, useless opinion. Great cartoon. To who?
And this shape lived in a two-dimensional world, and he meets this circle, and the circle can grow bigger and smaller. He says, look, I'm actually a sphere. I'm not growing bigger and smaller. I'm just going through your dimension. You see a two-dimensional slice of me, which how would he see? How would he get over to see it?
Yeah, and who's doing the slicing? So again, more just nonsense, right? I mean, you can change perspectives, yes, and with 3 dimensions you have more perspective to change. So what?
But anyway, and it's something like that.
It's something like that. So now I guess what he's trying to say is that a photon is something like that. Somehow it's spreading in 3 dimensions. That it's actually waving in 3 dimensions. So there's a bunch of energy going in all kinds of directions, but the photon never lands in any of those locations. It always just lands in one location. So even though it dispenses a bunch of energy going to a bunch of places, it never goes, which doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense to me at all. That somehow you can, whatever, send your signals through your medium for free. Okay, it doesn't cost you any energy. And then on top of that, your medium will allow you to sample all locations and then somehow decide which location you're going to go to. Yeah, well, that's your bullshit. By some magical mechanism where the photon creates a copy of itself to interfere with and then decide where it's going, which doesn't make any sense. And again, decides based on a probability equation where somehow it has to know what it did all the other times it did it. How does it know? Does it roll dice to decide? Does it flip a coin to decide to get the probabilities right? What device does it use to figure out how to get these probabilities correct?
I mean,
we know in water waves the device used is fatigue. The reason why there's more light in the center and less light as you go out further is fatigue. There's less energy. That's why there's less light.
So when you shine white light,
less waves, and I meant to say, obviously, I'm arguing that light isn't a wave. But in water waves, the reason why the pattern gets, the probabilities created in that pattern, those probabilities are created because the amount of energy going those longer distances is less energy.
Through a slit, you see diffraction.
So you don't see it in water waves in the sense you don't see, yes, you see diffraction in the sense that you see a wave front. You put a wave in, the wave continues to do what it was doing before it got to the slit, which is spread, okay, and weaken. Now, in light, all you see is a photon land at a specific location. And again, you don't have any explanation for how you decide that you're going to make two photons with one single slit. And it's completely arbitrary. They just invent a fake middle. So it's like they're saying that 1,000,000 of something is going to be created, right, in a confined space. And what they do is basically say it's always an odd number of infinite things. So there's no infinite amount of little wavelets that ever comes out to be an even number, because they always want to put something right in the middle so they can create two separate waves. Or you could say they always go with an even number, so there is no middle. So it always has to be two clumps, okay, because they eliminated the possibility of there being an odd man out. And that's all they've done. And it's completely arbitrary. It's just made up. It's just erroneous to the one purpose, which is create fake evidence, create an argument that somehow makes this work. So their argument is this fake theory that they've never demonstrated there's any hope of it ever finding any proof for, that an infinite number of little waves are created in front of a wave, okay, to create the next wave. And that there just happens to be the right number, so there's no middle, so they have to cut it into two separate waves. And that's it. It's just completely made up. There's no absolute rational reason why a single wave goes in and two waves come out. No reasoning for that. Just a fake notion of we're going to force it to happen. We're just going to make up an excuse to argue that everything cancels out except for this middle thing, and therefore there's two waves. It's just a contrivance.
The prism, you see this refraction that makes a rainbow.
Right, and no one's arguing the existence of the rainbow or the refraction. We're arguing what's the cause and what's really happening. Well, we know that what's happening is the light is being bent by a specific amount based on its frequency. That's one of the components that's going to dictate how much it spreads. And then the thickness of the glass, in a sense, will also dictate, because the thicker the glass is, the more time the light spends traveling at the obtuse angle, and before it's put back to its normal angle again when it leaves. And we know that this is a phenomenon that happens inside the glass, happens on the surfaces, the reflection. Doesn't happen with a whole bunch of wave interference or any of that kind of crap. It happens right at the surface and right at the exit surface. That's when the angle changes. going through the surface.
Those are wave phenomena. The two slit
Again, they're not wave phenomena in any sense except you say so. The evidence doesn't scream it at all, as I keep pointing out over and over again. Depending on what wave experiment you look at, there's nothing at all similar. So again, in single slits, water waves behave just as we would expect. They just create one wave. It doesn't interfere with itself, and it doesn't create an interference pattern. With the photons, it does create an interference problem. So the two experiments are not alike. In the double slit, yes, you get an interference pattern in water, but what you don't get is an interference pattern that's inside an envelope of the single slit pattern in light. So it's not the same pattern. And then with multi-slits, you get nothing similar. Again. And you're saying this is convincing evidence. I'm saying no, to a rational person, this is not convincing evidence. I have no reason to say, yes, I'm so convinced. What do you think I'm not convinced by? I mean, do you think there's some reason I'm not convinced except for the fact that there's no evidence convincing me, and that your theory is dependent on me completely making something up, not being able to see it, no experiments demonstrating it, to believe in some dopey Huygens thing of an infinite number of waves? I'm supposed to believe there's an infinite number of something in this space? And you're saying that's your best logical shot? You're saying that's good reasoning? Good reasoning is believing in the story of the infinite number of little waves? That's not good reasoning. It's certainly not good physics.
Interference, you see a wave phenomena whenever you shine a bright light.
No, so whenever you do that, you don't see a wave interference pattern. And again, as I've argued with the radar experiment, you can use exactly the same geometry and recognize that, no, the only thing you did was jam the two signals. You jammed the radio. And that's why you have places where there's silence and then places where it's twice as loud and then places silent and twice as loud. It's because you're jamming it. And when you put an audio track on the base signal, the reason why it's twice as loud is because of the artifact of modulation. Modulation does that. It creates 4 times the amplification of the signal.
Light through there. Now, when you lower the energy down to the point that you're dealing with this Planck constant issue.
So again, this isn't about lowering energy down. It's about lowering the number of photons. So, this is supposed to be a guy who defends Richard Feynman. Well, Richard Feynman would hate what you're saying here, because clearly he understands that you can't lower the intensity of the photons at all. They're always clumps. They're always hit with the same impact. All you can do is change the number of them. So again, it isn't anything like a wave, and he made that explicit point. This is evidence against wave theory, is the very fact that you can't tone the photon down. You can't turn it into half a photon or a quarter of a photon. You can't make a weak or strong wave.
Of, whole units of energy, you start to see just a speck of light at a time.
Yeah, everything's made of the pieces that make it up. So clearly any pattern of light is made up of a bunch of photons. I mean, the image on my screen is made of a bunch of pixels that are constantly being updated. This isn't brain surgery kind of stuff. I mean, who you fooling? Come on, light. Why the hell aren't you turning on? So again, this is just mush. To pretend that's insightful somehow. They've done the experiment with single photons. Single photons land as individual clumps. They're clearly not interfering with each other in the two-slit experiment, so you have to figure they have to somehow be interfering with themselves. And that's where you get into your silly story that the single photon somehow knows to split into two to go through the two slits, and then you have the contradiction where when now the split photons go through the single slit, somehow they don't Huygens now, because then you'd end up with 4 waves. So somehow single slits don't create the Huygens effect. So, it doesn't fit. It's just garbage.
The particle, the evidence of the particle. You never see the particle shooting by. but you see this evidence of the particle. And
Yeah, we all see only one thing, the evidence of the byproduct, okay? We don't get to see the product being made. We don't get to see the explicit cause. We just get to see the effect. And the effect can simply be described as the simplest pattern you can create, on, off, on, off, on, off. And they say every time on-off happens, we have to believe it's wave interference. That on-off can't be created by anything else. And that's how dumb or simply stupid their argument is. It's that narrow-minded, it's that pathetically rigid and irrational. It's just irrational to argue that you somehow have proven that every on-off pattern that the universe creates is created by wave interference. It's just irrational for you to propose such a thing, to argue such a thing.
I liken that to if a small tsunami, a rogue wave, is coming up to the beach, and it comes up and it hits the boardwalk, and it knocks just one board off.
Well, that would be a phase argument then, right? Because the wave is traveling in the sense that the pressure travels. So if it's moving towards the boardwalk, it's just going to annihilate all the boards as the pressure wave passes through. Now, you want to argue it's coming at some kind of angle. Well, I don't know. But, I mean, it's just crap as an argument. All right, we're not talking about what board was nailed on. We know the board that's going to fly off isn't going to fly off because the wave hit it harder. We know it's going to fly off because it's a weaker board or some other reason like that. So there's going to be a physical reason for one board to fly off and all the rest of the boards to stay there. A physical reason. And you're the ones eliminating all the physics. You're saying that the surfaces in the light experiments can't possibly be responsible for the effect. You're basically saying they're solid surfaces, they're benign, they don't do anything, and the photon has all these magical powers. When clearly the logical explanation is, just like with the boardwalk example, the board that flies off is because the board is weaker. And in the light experiment going through surfaces, the light is deflected because the surface is a complex area of atomic structure, and the photons are in fact being diffracted, just like they're being diffracted going into a surface, refracted. The diffraction is just like the refraction. It's obeying a rule, and the rule is a physical circumstance created by the surfaces, not created by the photon.
Splashes against the boardwalk, knocks one board off. In the morning when they come down there to look at the boardwalk, they're like, oh look, it looks like a single cannonball must have hit this board. It just knocked it clean off.
Well, we know the photons always land as single cannonballs, so again, they don't do anything like a wave. The wave doesn't spread, it doesn't get weaker, it doesn't do any of the things that waves and mediums do. So it has nothing in common with them in terms of speed, momentum, or, again, just physical movement, in the sense that we know of no medium wave that travels to all the locations and then somehow collapses and goes to one place. Somehow the wave just disappears. All the movement in the medium somehow just vanishes and never goes anywhere. So you have the propagation in the medium, and somehow the medium, when it gets near an object, it disappears. It says, I'm not going to hit it. It just magically goes away. So the momentum disappears. That's your theory. You're arguing that momentum can just disappear. It's nonsense.
The rest of them are in place. Now, the only mystery in this right now, to use this...
Look, they took them hundreds of years to play with this thing. Oh, come on. Where is this light? I mean, it's a motion sensor. It really should... it really should be able to pick this up. It always does. I really shouldn't have to... I don't know. Anyway. Just being stubborn, I guess. Termites, whatever. No, where was I? Yeah, damn it, I lost it. Well, anyway, I've probably already made the point. It seemed the point I wanted to reiterate.
Metaphor is, why just one boardwalk board?
Right, again. So he's going to try to figure out how he's going to give this knowledge of probability to the photon, that somehow the photons can figure this out by doing wave experiments or geometry experiments or any of this. And again, we already know that this happens right at the surfaces. I mean, instantly at the surfaces, this bending takes place. It doesn't take any time for waves to go interfere with themselves in some location or any of this kind of garbage. And again, where does all that extra momentum go? If the waves are doing all of this, how do they just turn the momentum off in all the wrong locations? It just doesn't make any sense.
The answer would be, well, the probability.
And again, in water waves, the probability is dictated by the fact that the further away you go, the weaker it's going to get. So, because the force is diminishing. So we know in the water wave experiment, if you could make the energy like a photon perpetual, that is lossless, that there wouldn't be any probabilities, would be even. There wouldn't be a declining probability. And in water waves, there's a declining probability because the waves get tired. In photons, what's the explanation? Because the photons don't get tired. In my opinion, the only rational explanation is that at the surface, the probability is decided, and it's a known probability that it's less likely to hit 7. It's hard to hit 7 electrons than it is to hit 6 or 5 or 4 or 3. And the more you hit, the more you deflect. And that's why the probabilities diminish as you go further out. There's a reason, a physical reason. And it's not consistent with why it happens in water waves.
The probability was that one boardwalk, and so one got knocked. Well, but why would a wave hitting the whole thing have a probability?
So we have no evidence that happens with water waves. There's no evidence that the water wave hits one board harder than the other boards or any of that crap. So you just sort of implying something that isn't true. There's no information in the wave that decides which board pops up. That's decided by how well the boards are nailed on the boardwalk.
Even if there was 100,000 feet boards in the boardwalk and it was 1 in 100,000, there could be 0, it could be 2 or 3. And in fact, this
So more bullshit, just talk. I mean, this has nothing to do with any real world experiment. So he's connected nothing to a real experiment, connected nothing to all the experiments. That is, recognizing where his theory is consistent, where his theory is inconsistent. He's just ignored the inconsistencies. And it's just selling hype.
The fact you do see with probabilism. So the weird thing about the puzzle part, the riddle, is that there's a covariance.
So the point I tried to make before, he uses this word "weird" part. Again, this experiment's always been weird, and it might remain weird for a while, because again, it is an unexpected result. In the sense, it's against your intuition saying photons shouldn't be bent by anything because they aren't bent by anything. But clearly, if you understand there's electrons near surfaces, okay, yeah, photons do hit electrons, and you can do Feynman diagrams for the implications of that. The energy goes in. The electron, if it's in tension, if it's already connected to something, then yeah, it's not going to be hit and fly free like a cue ball on a pool table. If you tie the cue ball to a string, or you put it with rubber bumpers against it, then where your photon's going to go is going to be different.
It's right. Variance is the amount of randomness, error, you could possibly say, or entropy in a measurement.
Again, so none of this has anything to do with the probability. We know it's a very consistent, and we know that it's either this. I mean, it always ends up being the same. So again, there's no unreliability in these results. They're always really consistent. It's either 3 degrees, 6 degrees, 9 degrees, 12 degrees. There's very little variation from those themes.
This is the variance of data. Covariance is when neighboring values have a correlated noise. Their errors are actually correlated, right? And so
again, the noise in any of these experiments usually has to do with the fact that we don't use a laser beam that has one single frequency. It might look red, but red means it's 720 nanometers, or it's 685, or it can be in a range of frequencies, and that's where you're getting the little bit of fuzz and blur. But the more precise your frequency in, the more precise your frequency out in terms of the very sharpness of the angles.
The probability of that wave knocking a board off was exactly one board's worth of probability, and it knocked off one board. Now,
so again, there's no evidence that water waves do any of this probabilistic board knocking, so that's just more nonsense. And again, the idea is that in water waves, the interference pattern is really an up and down. So it's up and down. More aggressive waves are no waves. So it's not like the photon at all, in the sense that it's twice as much energy and twice as less. I mean, complete zero. Where the other, so it goes high and it goes low, the water. High, low, and then there's a part that just stays consistent. So it's not really a parallel to what photons are doing, because we know there's no such thing as a negative photon. So in that sense, it's not consistent again. And again, we also know that the energy that was going to the place that's neutral, like in waves, it's truly neutral. It's not either low pressure or high pressure. It's not a zero. It's like the pressure would be a 3, and then the wavy part would be 3 and -3, or 0. So that would be the extremes. So again, there's no parallel here. Water waves aren't the same, and the reason why it gets weaker as you go further away is because the wave traveling through the medium it's absorbing all the energy, and that's why there's less movement over here. There's not less wave. The waves have less amplitude. Not like a photon at all.
Wave came up and it was not, it only had a 100,000th of the strength in any one point that it takes to knock off a board. It wouldn't knock off any boards in classical situation. But in the real situation, somehow it can come up with this sort of weak probability. But since the whole...
So again, there's no, like I said, in the wave theory, there's the probability is just tied to these certain locations. That's part of the probability. But the fact that it's a declining probability in terms of amplitude and total amplitude in the photon experiment can be understood that, yeah, that's just because it's less likely to be bent more. Bending requires structure, and you can understand that hitting more structure is harder than hitting just one. Hitting a home run is more difficult than getting a base hit. I mean, it's that kind of logic.
Whole probability adds up to 1. It'll go ahead and knock off one board. It's 100,000th of a chance of each board.
So it's a non-existent experiment he's describing. It's not even valid as a thought experiment. It has no continuity to anything real, and he's pretending he's explaining wave mechanics in either circumstance, water or in photons, and he's describing neither accurately or with anything called real evidence. And yet he's saying somehow you should believe me, even though I can't provide you anything called real evidence, and I can't even do a thought experiment that's bound to a model that's anything coherent to anything we know is a real model. I mean, a good model. So he's not even using a good model to pretend this is how things work.
Board's going to get knocked off. That's the only riddle. But it has to be...
Again, it's the riddle of the experiment is understanding what is really happening. And again, the multi-slit experiment tells you a lot about what's really happening, because actual images end up being projected at the locations. So there's fewer, they're spread more, and further, faster, and there's fewer spots created, and they're actual images of what goes in to the multi-slits. So they're actually projecting the structure that goes in. The photons that go in are being replicated at the new location. Now you can't do that with wave interference, because you ruin the image by pushing stuff. You create distortions. So you could never project an image with wave interference.
Waves, because a wave can be a cross section. A wave can come up to a boardwalk and knock one thing off. But
so again, he keeps using a metaphor or analogy that has nothing to do with any physical reality on this planet Earth, and that has nothing to do with a reasoned model explaining how the model is the reality. So he's done nothing reasonable here in terms of making a fair argument about what the evidence suggests. He's just making an argument out of hype and just using a bunch of all the physicists agree with me kind of notion. I'm right because they say we're right. We all say we're right, so we're right. We don't have to defend this crap. We can just say it as if it's true.
The sand, there's the pattern of the wave coming. If a cannonball is flying in there and hits the one board and knocks it off, that doesn't explain the pattern that's left on the beach.
It does if you change where the cannonball's flying, okay, by having it hit something. So again, you're just pretending that slits, surfaces, create no interference themselves. They don't make anything in the atmosphere at all. They don't change the environment the cannonball's flying through. But clearly, if I hung a bunch of cannonballs from a crane, and then I shot cannonballs through that field of cannonballs held in places, you'd understand that some of the cannonballs would hit one of those other cannonballs and be deflected. Now, if I did it in a very precise way, like all the cannonballs were lined up in certain locations, I could probably create a very probabilistic pattern of impacts and deflections. And I might end up with the pattern just like the electron experiment with the single and double slit. The electron experiment creates very good waves because clearly electrons do bounce off of each other. So when electrons are forced go into surfaces, they're hitting the electrons just as the photons would. But when electrons hit electrons, they don't really hit each other. They bounce off each other's fields, so there's a much smoother deflection. And that's why you're getting a much smoother pattern. So all of this can be explained rationally, within the confines of a nice mechanical universe, without all this wishy-washy, mushy, everything's flowing and waving in some medium that doesn't exist. You have no explanation for how this medium creates this tension necessary to create a wave out of a simple propagation. I poke it and somehow it turns the poke into a wave. How does your medium know how to do that? And clearly, how does your medium contract the wave or discount the wave or discontinue the wave? How does it know when I'm making this spherical noise in the medium? How does the medium know to eliminate all the sound except the one that's going to go right to this ear? The ear over here hears it. All the other ears don't hear a thing. How does it do that? You have no explanations for any of this. It's just such an extraordinary theory. You might as well just be claiming there's UFOs and you've seen them. And now you're sitting here and just telling me I have to believe it because you say so. But you don't have any evidence.
So, QED proved my point.
So, as demonstrated. So, what did he demonstrate? Did he really demonstrate anything in these two videos? Did he really, in any way, show us any evidence of anything? He has some background pictures of water waves that, for me, don't say photon at all. I don't know how that says photon. And space. Space is a heavy fluid that rolls and then collapses on the beach. I don't think so. I don't think there's any reason to believe that. It doesn't make any sense to me at all. It's not consistent with the evidence in any way.
Sure, every rational person now agrees with me in every way possible.
Right, so you're just making some kind of satirical joke, but you're also, in a sense, actually arguing that somehow these simplistic comparisons, it seems like, it looks like, and then you forget about all the evidence where it doesn't look like, you ignore it, and that all of that is somehow being a rational, fair cop kind of do your job as a physicist or a scientist or a rational thinker. You've done your job. You've excluded all the evidence that you don't like, and you've just presented the evidence that supports your case, and you're saying somehow you're doing a good lawyer's work. And in my opinion, you're just a shyster. A despicable shyster.
I just don't see any other way that it could possibly be going.
So in a way, he's laughing a little bit, right? So you're what? You're conceding the argument. You have pathetically weak evidence, and yet you're so fucking arrogant. You'll insult other people's intelligence and their integrity if they don't buy your stupid religious theory, and that's all it is. It's just a pile of fairy tales. You've got nothing in terms of hard evidence, and all you have is your faith.
With these graphics, my sound's working, so Hythloday is going to be like, good job, your sound is working, and you didn't even feign checking it. And you've got a green screen, it's working, that's pretty crisp for an amateur, and look at those pictures of waves. You are obviously typing a term into...
Yes, well, green screens are fun and nice, but, it really is, they're kind of discriminatory, because frankly, if you have blonde hair, green screens fucking suck. Because yellow is too much like green. Light on. Fucker.
Google Images as your background. Very clever, efficient, saving of time and whatnot.
Right, so again, talking about photons by showing water waves. Oh, great. Again, this is just such fucking propaganda. It's despicably pitiful science.
QED proved my point. So
no, you didn't. QED doesn't mean prove my point. It means you've demonstrated something. Again, where have you demonstrated anything with evidence, logic, reasoning? There's absolutely nothing here persuasive to anyone who doesn't want to believe in waves. I mean, if you're not somebody who has a horny for waves, there's absolutely no reason to convert to a waveist based on the nothing you presented as evidence.
Over.
Terrible. Just such garbage. Alright. It's nice that I can't grab a scroll bar. There's 400 million related videos till I get to a comment. Alright, so gives new meaning to the term a slice of life, does it not? Wink. No, it doesn't do any of that. So this is God, Emperor, Palatine. So a kook. Religious kook. Space must be bigger than we think. Why? In order to accommodate anything higher than 3D. And again, why are you even trying to imagine something different than 3D? Again, you can't really attach a fourth dimension. The third dimension attaches to two dimensions quite logically. I mean, it attaches logically. I mean, simply. It's just as simple as the 2D attached to the 1D. They attach to each other simply. Okay? There's no room for 4 or 5 or 6. There's no room for them. There's no finger that can make them. There's no line that can make them. All the other dimensions can just be created by a straight line. You can't create the fourth dimension with a straight line. You're just imagining something that's completely fake. There's no example of a fourth dimension. There's no reason to believe in it. If you saw a cube, there'd be reason to believe in 3 dimensions. But you haven't seen a fourth dimension. Why do you think they exist? Except your own wishful thinking. Wave contemplation is crazy. So again, it's a simple phenomenon in mediums. So again, if you think space is a medium, you're still stuck with the illogic of the medium having energy in it and it's somehow retracting the energy or making the energy go away. The only way this wave crap works is you have to make most of the energy disappear for the photon to land in one location. It doesn't make any sense. It's like macro scale superposition to watch them go through water. So again, if you think waves are mysterious, I mean, I can see some sort of, when there's simple waves, though. I mean, they're so simple. The only time it gets a little interesting is when, you start changing the slope, the amount of pressure in the compression, and then the wave starts to move faster on the surface than it is on the ground because it's friction. And so then the wave collapses because the pressure runs over itself. But once you understand how it works, there's nothing. Yes, it's the best. See, they're silly people. I don't know. I mean, it's like, I don't know what to describe it as. I guess there's people who could be fascinated watching a cockroach race. And so they're really into watching waves or something. It's like waves on pool at night with pool lights on. Crazy. So again, it's something you can completely understand, in terms of there's a whole bunch of action and there's a whole bunch of angles that the lights are going through, and the light's getting refracted at a whole bunch of angles. Wow. Crazy. And they're doing physics. All right. There's a book called The Wave Watcher's Companion that is really cool. See, this is all just for children, He walks through all the kinds of waves at a deep but not esoteric level. Set off a few big picture nonverbal epiphanies about how it all moves. So you need an epiphany to be able to understand pressure moving through a medium. Seeing a bunch of different wave types dissected one after another. There really aren't wave types, there's just combinations. By its nature, a wave is one thing. It's just pressure moving in a direction. That's it, from high pressure to low pressure. So all you can do is combine a bunch of pressures. What do you mean a wave can be a cross-section? Well, I guess he's meaning that there's no point in even trying to figure that out, frankly. Because even in wave interference, right? I mean, the waves going straight will always hit first, and so you'd say, well, why wouldn't those be the ones collapsing first? I got what you meant by cross-section when it comes to viewing something 3D in a sphere in the second world, but I don't get what you mean by cross-section with a wave. So he'll probably give a simple dopey answer and he'll accept it. A photon particle is actually just a cross-section of a wavefront. So again, how so? If I cut a sphere, I get a circle that starts off very small and then it gets bigger and it gets bigger and it's bigger. The whole point is photons don't land as rings. Single photon doesn't create a ring. So none of this makes any sense. Imagine a light wave was a water wave. Again, on the surface of water in 2 dimensions again? The photon would be a little slice of that wave hitting a particular part of the beach. Sliced how? A slice means it has to have 2 ends at least. The diameter across the 2-dimensional part would have 2. And then 3 dimensions would be a ring. It's not how the photon lands. So he says, I see now, thanks. So, just amazing. Blind leading the blind. Keep this up and you may not end up in a basement at 60. I guess that's a reference to me. The fact that I end up in a basement is irrelevant. Again, Einstein was a patent clerk. If it wasn't for a pretty bogus hype regarding, the New York Times being fooled by an experiment that sucked, Einstein might have been a plumber. So fuck you and your bullshit. What? So I guess Piro doesn't understand. My house doesn't have a basement. So, again, over his head. The guy was actually complimenting you, retard, saying that, wow, yeah, if you do more of this little trivial physics, you won't be like in Mendham, making videos from a basement. Even though, again, they can't make any counter arguments. I mean, this Brandon Kratz is too big a coward to make a video. He's got an icon that's all, faggoty mush. But where's his counter argument? Again, I have in the subject video playlist, there's a couple of videos on magnetism. Explain how those theories can't be correct, and explain how they leave something out. They, where they do what regular physics does, which don't even explain where the energy comes from. Magnets move because they say they move. They don't move because forces act on them that came from anywhere. The magnet somehow exerts a force, and yet it doesn't burn any nuclear energy. It doesn't burn any gasoline. It doesn't create a heat pump. There's no source of energy. Just magical movement, and that's your physics. And you're going to insult somebody else when you're walking and talking such absolute crap. Where do you live, weasel? Why don't you show your face so I can mock it, you coward. You fucking coward. People are despicable cowards. Alright, so enough of this crap. And it's all crap. I mean, you're all just such despicable cowards. It's just disgusting. Piro's answered not one of the questions I asked, right? And his cop-out reason is, oh, you might call me a shithead. And so what? You're too big a little panty-wearing, wet panty-wearing girly man. You can't take it, little pussy. No, you can't answer the questions, and that's the fucking truth. You have no answer, because your physics sucks. It has no evidence. It's just all make-believe. And you've barely glued a bunch of silly pictures together to make some other image, and then you say, look at the image, it looks just like. And you've cheated all over the place to make it look that way. You keep saying it's the most proven theory in the history of mankind. It proved nothing. It predicted nothing. You're just so full of shit. Okay. So, probably enough of a video. I'll declare it so anyway. And such. Yeah, just horse shit everywhere. Nothing too interesting. So, till the next time, and such, so forth and whatnot.